Welcome back to Green Dolphin Science, everyone. Great to have you with us.
Hey there.
For this deep dive, we're tackling a listener-submitted stack of research, which is always fun. It's focused on mercury levels in southern ocean marine megafauna.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff in here.
Right at the top is a study called Mercury Levels in Humpback Whales and Other Southern Ocean Marine Megafauna. So our goal today is to really get a handle on the current baseline.
Exactly. What's the mercury exposure look like in different Antarctic animals? We're talking everything from tiny krill right up to the big guys, whales, seals.
And what that baseline tells us about the health of, well, a pretty vital ecosystem down there.
Think of it like an environmental health check for the Antarctic. We're asking how much of this toxin mercury is actually in these animals right now.
Okay, so let's unpack mercury itself first. We generally know it's bad news. The study flags it as a potent neurotoxin.
Yeah, that means it messes with the nervous system. And it's linked to developmental issues, potentially cancer, reproductive problems.
Yeah.
In both wildlife and humans.
Right. And where's it all coming from?
Well, some is natural volcanoes, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of it, maybe the bigger chunk these days, is from us. Burning fossil fuels, industrial stuff.
And the tricky part is it doesn't just stay where it's produced.
Not at all. This atmospheric mercury, it can travel huge distances, just carried on the wind. So even Antarctica, which feels so remote, it's still vulnerable to pollution from, well, potentially anywhere.
Which leads to these things called atmospheric mercury depletion events, AMDEs. Sounds pretty intense. What's actually happening there?
It is pretty dramatic. Yeah, basically you get these periods in Antarctica where the mercury levels in the air just plummet. They drop suddenly.
Okay.
And scientists think this is a major way mercury actually gets deposited into the Southern Ocean environment. It's kind of falling out of the atmosphere.
And what causes that drop?
It seems linked to a couple of things. Could be related to ozone chemistry, especially the ozone hole situation down there, or sometimes just when air masses kind of stall, allowing specific chemical reactions to happen that pull mercury out.
So it falls into the ocean. But that's not the end of the story, is it? It changes form. I remember reading something about a more problematic version.
Got it.
Oh.
Once that inorganic mercury hits the water, you've got these tiny organisms, bacteria mostly, acting like little chemical converters. They turn it into methylmercury, MEG.
And that's the one we really worry about.
That's the one, because it gets taken up by living things really easily. And then it does two nasty things. Bioaccumulation.
Meaning it builds up in one animal over its life.
Precisely. And biomagnification.
Which is where it gets more concentrated as you go up the food chain.
Exactly. Krill eat plankton with a bit of mercury. Seals eat krill. Bigger seals or whales eat those seals. The concentration just goes up and up at each step.
So the top predators get the highest dose. Makes a grim kind of sense. Now, the study mentions the Minamata Convention. Why bring that up?
Yes. The Minamata Convention is a global treaty, really important. Its whole aim is to protect us and the environment from mercury. And a key part of that is stressing how crucial long-term monitoring is. We need to track this stuff. The Arctic, they've had monitoring programs for a while. But the Antarctic, well, it's lagged behind a bit.
So this study is helping fill that gap.
Definitely. Really highlights why we need good baseline data for the South Pole region, too. We need to know what's going on.
And there was already some intriguing data from down there, wasn't there? Something about mercury levels being different depending on water depth.
Yeah, that was a fascinating earlier finding. Higher concentrations of methylmercury found in deeper Antarctic waters compared to the surface.
Which seems a bit counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it suggests that where an animal feeds, how deep it dives, could really influence how much mercury it's exposed to. A surface feeder versus a deep diver might have very different mercury loads.
Which brings us nicely to the main players in this study. The marine megafauna, the big animals. They're called sentinels of ocean health. Why that term?
Think of them as like the ocean's early warning system. Canaries in the coal mine, if you like. Because they live a long time, and they're often high up the food chain. They accumulate contaminants like mercury over years, even decades. So studying them gives us a really valuable long-term view of what's happening in the ecosystem.
And historically, the focus was more on seals and seabirds.
Yeah, quite a bit of work on them. Whales, especially baleen whales, less so. Minke whales got some attention, partly because of historical whaling data. But this study really zooms in on humpbacks.
Through the Humpback Whale Sentinel Program, HWSP, sounds like a smart approach using them as monitors.
It really is. Humpbacks in that Antarctic sea ice zone, they're secondary consumers. They eat enormous amounts of Antarctic krill,
Right at the base of that magnification ladder we talk about.
Exactly. So they're perfectly positioned to show us how contaminants are moving from krill upwards.
And their migration helps. That massive journey they take.
It does, practically speaking. They migrate to warmer waters to breed, which makes them more accessible for researchers. You can actually get out there and collect samples.
Non-lethal samples, importantly.
Crucially, yes. Small skin and blubber biopsies. You get the data without harming the whale. And this study, it gives us the first proper published results on mercury accumulation, specifically in these Antarctic humpbacks, using this method.
Okay, let's get into the results then. What did they find across all these different creatures they sampled? You mentioned a big range.
A huge range, yeah. Total mercury, or HGT, went from really low, about 5 nanograms per gram dry weight.
Which is incredibly tiny.
Minuscule, yeah. That was in humpback whale skin and blubber. All the way up to 6,300 nanograms per gram dry weight in Antarctic fur seals from the Antarctic Peninsula area.
Wow. Okay, nearly 1,300 times higher at the top end, roughly. Let's break that down. Starting with the krill, the foundation.
Right, the krill. Their mercury levels were pretty consistent with what other studies have found. But here's an interesting wrinkle. The juveniles and subadults actually had higher levels than the adults.
That seems backwards, doesn't it? Why would younger ones have more?
Yeah, it's a bit puzzling. The researchers floated a few ideas. Maybe younger krill hang out closer to shore early on, where mercury could be more concentrated.
Possibly.
Or maybe it's their diet, perhaps feeding more undersea ice, which some think is a source of methylmercury. Could even be concentration due to starvation, if times are tough. Or maybe adult females offload some mercury into their eggs when they reproduce.
Ah, like passing it on?
Could be. They found the lowest levels in females that had already spawned. Plus, they saw differences depending on where the krill were sampled. Levels weren't the same across the whole Southern Ocean. Suggests mercury availability varies geographically.
Okay, fascinating stuff, even in the tiny krill. Now, the humpbacks. You said low levels in skin and blubber?
Yes, very similar to the levels in the krill they eat, which on the surface might suggest not much bioaccumulation is happening in those tissues.
I sense a but coming.
There's a big but. They only managed to get one muscle sample from a humpback. Just one. But in that single muscle sample, the mercury level shot up dramatically. 4,300 nanograms per gram.
Whoa, hold on. So spin and blubber around 5, muscle over 4,000.
Exactly. That's a massive difference.
So what's the takeaway there? That's huge.
The big takeaway is that sampling just the easily accessible skin and blubber might seriously underestimate the total mercury load a whale is carrying.
Right. It's not telling the whole story.
Not at all. It strongly suggests mercury gets partitioned, distributed differently inside the whale's body. It's likely building up much more in deeper tissues like muscle. And we know from studies on other cetaceans, dolphins and whales, that the liver often accumulates the highest concentrations.
That's a really critical point for anyone doing this kind of biomonitoring then.
Absolutely. A key methodological insight. You need to be aware of this tissue difference.
Did they see any difference between whales found stranded versus the ones they took live biopsies from?
Interestingly, no. They compared the levels, and there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the stranded ones and the live biopsied ones, which they assumed were juveniles or adults. So they could combine that data for some analyses.
Okay. And how did these humpbacks stack up against other whales down there, like minke whales?
Well, comparing the skin levels, the HGT in these humpbacks was about 5 times lower than levels found in Antarctic minke whales sampled in previous decades.
Lower. So is that good news? Maybe mercury levels are dropping overall?
It could be. It might reflect a real change over time.
Yeah.
But caution is needed. They had fewer humpback samples than the historical mink data. So it's suggestive, but not definitive yet.
What else could explain it?
Differences in feeding habits are a strong possibility. Minke whales tend to dive deeper than humpbacks, and their diets might be slightly different too.
Right, you mentioned different krill types earlier.
Exactly. Like fin whales eat more of a krill called Thysanowessa macrura, while humpbacks focus on the main Antarctic krill, Euphausia superba. And there's some thought that Thysanowessa might feed a tiny bit higher up the food web itself. Little differences can add up.
What about comparisons outside Antarctica, whales up north?
It's a bit tricky, honestly. Not a huge amount of comparable data for baleen whales in the Northern Hemisphere. But the studies that do exist, say on North Atlantic minke whales, they tend to show much higher mercury levels, like potentially 5 to 50 times higher than these Antarctic humpbacks.
Oh!
Yeah. And sperm whales, which are deuced whales eating bigger stuff like squid, They consistently show much higher levels globally, too.
Okay, let's move to the birds and seals. You said their levels kind of match their diet and place in the food web?
Generally, yes. The total mercury in their muscle tissue seem to line up with what you'd expect based on what they eat and their trophic level.
They're spot on the food chain.
Right. And while this study didn't do the isotope analysis itself to confirm diets, the researchers cross-referenced with nitrogen isotope data from other studies on the same species. And that data supports the idea that mercury is biomagnifying up the Antarctic food web.
Any specific examples stand out?
Well, young Adelie penguins had lower muscle mercury than adults. That clearly shows accumulation over time, as you'd expect. Though it's worth noting, reported levels in Adelies can vary quite a bit between studies, depending on location and tissue type.
And the petrels, any surprises there?
The white-chinned petrels had pretty elevated levels. That likely comes down to their diet. They eat a lot of mesopelagic fish.
Fish from those middle ocean depths?
Correct, where mercury dynamics might be different. Also, these particular petrels were sampled in the subantarctic, so maybe they also forage outside purely Antarctic waters sometimes. Latitude can definitely play a role in mercury levels for some seabirds and seals.
And finally, the Antarctic fur seals. That's where we saw those really high numbers, especially near the peninsula.
Exactly right. Big regional difference there. Seals from the Antarctic Peninsula had significantly higher mercury than seals from the eastern Antarctic.
Why such a difference?
Probably diet. Seals near the peninsula might eat more fish, maybe even some penguins, whereas eastern seals might rely more heavily on krill, which is lower down the food chain.
Makes sense.
Or it could be regional differences in the oceanography itself, affecting how mercury cycles and how available it is. Definitely needs more research to pin down those regional patterns.
Okay, so stepping back,
Yeah.
what's the big picture here? What does all this tell us about mercury in the Southern Ocean?
Well, it paints a complex picture, that's for sure. This deep dive gives us a really valuable snapshot of contamination down there.
Yeah.
On one hand, the relatively low levels in humpback skin and blubber seem kind of reassuring compared to some other predators or historical data. But then you have that sky-high muscle reading.
Right, that really complicates things.
It does. It raises big questions about where mercury is actually ending up inside these whales and what, if any, health effects it might be having long-term.
It really drives home that even Antarctica, as remote as it seems, isn't isolated from global pollution.
Not at all. And this study just hammers home how vital it is that we continue and actually expand biomonitoring efforts down there, especially with climate change adding another layer of complexity and global mercury pollution still an ongoing issue.
We need to understand all those connections: diet, trophic level, location, how the mercury moves around.
Precisely. That understanding is crucial if we want to actually assess the long-term health risks to this incredibly important ecosystem.
And it shows the real value of using these sentinel species, like the humpbacks. They really are windows into environmental change.
Absolutely. And the differences we see not just between species, but even between populations of the same species in different areas that underlines how localized impacts can be. We need detailed ecological studies to get the full picture.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. We know atmospheric mercury travels the globe, reaching even Antarctica. Given that, what's our responsibility globally to reduce these risks and protect these unique places and the amazing life they hold?
Yeah, it's a big question. Maybe take a look into the Minamata Convention on Mercury. See what's being done, or maybe what more needs to be done on a global scale to tackle this challenge.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on green dolphin science.